Welcome back to another episode of Just a Squirrel looking for a nut. trying to get out of this rut.
All right. We got all the words pretty much down except this.
Yeah.
That's one more to go. That gives us something to be ambitious about. It gives us a reason to have some drive.
Yeah.
And that's what we are here talking about tonight. We're talking about drive. You know, Oleg, as everyone who listens might have heard, or maybe some of y'all haven't, I grew up in the backwoods of Kansas. I always tell folks I'd go running out in the wheat fields, and then there was a meadow behind my house where horses would graze. There was a creek back there, and I'd go into that creek and I would look at crawdads and I'd find baby turtles and splash around, come home all muddy. And then I would listen to songs like Funky Town. Now, I'm not dating myself. It was on the oldies station, okay?
I was going to say, I can't relate.
And
I was not listening to songs like that.
Yeah. You're older than me anyway. And I knew there had to be something more for myself. I was determined to get out of Kansas. There were great things there, but it was not for me. And so I developed a drive to escape. I'm sorry, to leave. And so that led me down a path that has pushed my life into one that has been, if nothing else, unusual. You also have had a life story that you've shared, and I'm sure we'll share as and when you feel is appropriate in whatever way you do, that has exhibited a desire to change your station in this world. Tonight's topic is what is behind that. Why were either of us or both of us unhappy and unwilling to stay in the world, in the milieu that we grew up in? Why do you think I not only decided I wanted to leave Kansas, but found the wherewithal from within to get out?
I think for me, moving from, let's just pick my recent transition, moving from Ann Arbor, Michigan to Austin, having the drive to do it, but also having the courage to know that even though I'm moving 28 hours across the country, that's how far of a drive it was, I'll still be able to find the same things that I'm able to find in my hometown: friends, place of comfort, belonging, identity, and things like that. I think what was behind it, and the reason why drive is a dominant factor within my life, is I believe without drive, without change, it really changes who I am as a person. It changes my makeup. What I mean by that is having the ability to change and having the ability to experience growth. I personally experience a lot of tension when I'm not in those opportunities.
But why?
I don't know. I think it's just partially who I am. I think it's partially who I am as an individual, whether or not that's something I was born with or something that I had learned over time. Maybe that's the question that's worth exploring for me. And to what degree can I find the answer to that question? I have no idea. I will say that maybe one way to answer your question is because there's just something appealing. There's something that really interests me about the drive, the ability to change in general, growth. I find growth to be fascinating, as challenging as it can be sometimes. Still, knowing that I can change the circumstances, knowing that I can be literally a different person based on a set of outcomes and the actions that I take. There's something about it. I mean, it's kind of like the same exact thing. Why do you choose to go to the same roller coaster park? Or why do you choose to drive the same car? Or in your case, ride the same model of a bike? Just might be a different frame, but it's probably still the same thing. And it's getting to that point, I think, where I don't know, there might be a level of, it's kind of like there's a level of comfort in being uncomfortable. You know what I mean?
I'm going to ask you a question
Yeah.
that for those who are watching or listening who grew up in the US or Canada will be about as universal as is possible. We went to high school. And we all knew people in high school that were the popular kids or that were the regular kids that had their own groups of folks they hung out with. They may have been in band, they may have been in the stoner club, or they may have whatever.
Yeah.
And particularly if they were folks that were not raised in the mega cities like New York or Miami or Toronto or something like that, that could have, if they had so chosen, picked up their bags, packed them, and gone somewhere else and reinvented their lives. Or they could have chosen to reinvent their lives or become something that no one would have expected even within the milieu that they were in within high school. But when we go back to our reunions or we talk to folks who knew them, they stayed in a very limited lane. Or I should not say limited, because they may not feel like it's limited at all. That's a judgment statement on my part. They stayed in the exact same lane that they and their families or their social circle was in when they were high school. And in fact, perhaps some of them even resisted change at all costs.
Yeah.
Why were you someone that said, I'm excited and interested in change, I'm fascinated by it? Why do you think they did not?
It's a good question. Question that I've been trying to understand and answer to for however many years by now.
I want to answer now. And I want some of those folks watching to type in some thoughts about it too, because we love hearing from you.
You know, I think for me, when I started to look at change and embrace change as part of my journey, I had realized that not everyone was looking at change through the same exact lens. Many people, as you described, did not accept change, looked at change as something to shy away from, because change in many of the situations oftentimes brings a lot of uncertainty and discomfort. There's something about me and why I've been able to do that. And maybe much of that goes back to my not only early childhood experiences, but some of the experiences in the preceding years. And that is, I was sharing this story earlier today. One of the things I used to do with one of my best friends from back home is that when we were younger, we would go to Michigan football games, and instead of actually going to the games, we would scalp tickets, and so we would make money before the games.
You naughty little boy.
So let's say we would go to the game with $100 or $150 of our own money, buy 2 tickets, resell them, use portions of that profit pocket, buy another 2 tickets, resell that. And so it would accumulate all this money towards the end. But what it taught me, I think, was not only the importance of having strong communication skills and the ability to persuade and negotiate and things like that, but it was also the importance of getting comfortable with the unknown. So we never knew whether or not we were going to be able to find the tickets. We never knew who was going to buy the tickets. We never knew what the price that person was going to buy the tickets at. But what we did know and what we did have is that belief that it's possible. I think there is actually, I'm sure you're familiar with Les Brown or anyone else.
I may have heard someone like that.
That might be
that name before.
That might be listening.
Les, I know you watch this show. You can type in right now. I know you're on LinkedIn this very moment.
He has this speech I come across however many years by now. I think the title of it is called "It's Possible," and he essentially talks about a journey and envisioning a possibility of something being real before you're able to attain that thing. And I think the same exact thing applies to me being able to approach change. I know that change is going to create a different set of circumstances, but there's something about that concept that once again is fascinating to me, that it's the possibility that I can change. So if I'm experiencing a set of circumstances right now that I don't view as favorable, change is that avenue. It's that channel that can help me see the other side of it. Living in the hometown and staying there for however many years, it's funny that you mentioned that because a friend of mine recently had reached out to me, same exact town, and she was describing to me the situation that she's going to move into a different state and how she was terrified of the process because she's never moved before. She's always been in the same place. Now, I've lived in Austin for going on to 5 years now, but I could relate because I remembered the first year how challenging it was to be so many miles apart from that hometown and being in a complete place of discomfort and not knowing where some of these resources are going to come from, such as friends, having opportunities to process the changes that were introduced into my life. But within that, I think it was just that belief that was ingrained within me that I'll figure it out. So in a way, I think that belief, because it's so strong, it almost becomes like a game. I want to go after it. Like I want to capture it. I want to attain certain elements of it.
I am in a very quizzical mood tonight.
Uh-huh.
And you're not going to be able to stop me. Oleg, is the rumor I heard true that you were born in Russia?
I was.
If you had, and is it true?
Yeah.
That you made a change in your familial situation at a relatively young age?
Yeah. 9 years old.
And is it true that that was a choice that you made as opposed to a choice that was made for you?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Oleg, what do you think your life would be like if you had never made that choice? Describe to us what your life might be like today.
I think it'd be very different. I think it would be very different in terms of, I don't think I would be even close to pursuing what I'm pursuing today. I don't think I would have the same level of freedom to be able to live my own life on my own terms, to do things such as even recording a podcast. I think there's something about the American culture that carries a lot of weight and a lot of truth with it, and that is the possibility of actually living the dream that you envision and creating the life that you want to build and aspire for. Now, is that an easy route to go? Absolutely not. At least my journey taught me other ways. I faced more challenges on a daily basis that do put me in situations of whether I question what I'm doing is right or not, or in alignment with who I'm trying to become. But I will say that, it's hard. It's hard to do that for me. It's hard to put myself in that situation and imagine what would life be like if I wasn't in the circumstances that I'm in right now. In fact, there was another question that was asked earlier today. I was on Thomas's podcast called The Crisis Compass. And his co-host had asked me the question. She said, if you could go back in time, would you change anything about it? And I said, no, I wouldn't change a single thing about it because it is all of those events and experiences that make up who I am today. It's all of those events and experiences that have given me the drive that I have today, the ability to persevere, the resilience that I have to this point. And if any one of them were different, I don't think I would be sitting here having this conversation with you as well as the audience.
But let's be real. At 9 years old, unless you're even more prodigious than I thought you were. And by the way, if you were thinking this at 9 years old, then please tell me, and I will officially just put a sack over my head and hide in fear, and I'll never come into your presence again.
Right.
At 9 years old in Russia, and I was going to say, you're not in. It is my understanding you were not in. Whoa, what is going on? You were not in the middle of St. Petersburg, Moscow,
correct.
Right? Some cosmopolitan
very
place.
Small town. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so you were not aware of the potential opportunities America had. You were not I assume, aware of the political and economic differences at age 9 between Russia and the United States. Is that correct?
Correct. I wasn't even aware of the potential that Russia had provided for me.
Right. So you made a choice.
Yeah.
To embrace something that was different. Was that choice, looking back on it, honestly, something from within you? Or was that something outside you? What was the critical moment, if you can share this, if you
Yeah.
remember? What was the critical moment when that choice happened? And the reason why I ask is because to me, that feels like it might be close to the root of my underlying question, which is why some people change their circumstances and some don't. What was that moment?
So I think for me, and you're absolutely spot on, it's more difficult to be able to articulate what was the origin of it. And the reason why is because I wasn't learning in the moment as it was happening. I was learning many, many years after the event took place. The challenge of learning in the moment compared to reflecting upon that moment moments later is that now there is a series of events that took place in between. And so the vision becomes a little bit blurry. It's a lot harder to articulate what was the origin, why did it happen, how did it happen, what did it feel like, because so many other events took in between that. As I think about that age, I think there were probably multiple factors that would play in a role. My own individual desire of wanting to change my circumstances, literally accepting any option or any possible availability to change the circumstances because the circumstances were so adverse.
You could have resigned yourself to them, though.
I could have done that, but because of how challenging it was, changing the course was really the only option. Now, I think within that also lies something that is probably within who I am, and that's not willing to accept the circumstances for what they are, especially if I'm given a chance to change them.
And that goes as to my personal fundamental question about drive. Something in you felt you had to make that change.
Yeah.
I recently read a very interesting article or chapter of a book about people in Roman times. They were usually the city-states that Rome conquered. What would happen first, at least during the period that I was reading about, was that the Roman emperor, Caesar, whatever, would come and say basically, look, we're Rome, you're not.
Yeah.
You can surrender or you cannot. And if the city-state would surrender, then essentially the nobility there, including the kings and queens, would become governors or clients of Rome. And their lives, they wouldn't be able to be the king of the entire empire, but they could at least hold on to their dignity and their status. However, some wanted to fight back. And those very proud kings and princes who had been raised in royalty their entire lives and were used to power and luxury and wealth and privilege would usually end up defeated by Rome and not killed right away. They would be captured, especially the highest levels, brought back to Rome and made slaves. And not just house slaves. Usually they would be going from the palace to the salt mines of Numidia or somewhere like that. Somewhere demeaning, somewhere horrifying where there was no hope. And what this article was saying was that those princes and kings and queens and the women, the fate was even worse than what would happen to the men for reasons I'm sure we could all imagine. They would usually end up accepting their fate. Usually it was shocking reading the accounts. These people would just sort of shrivel away and shrink into what appeared to be another human being altogether. Some wouldn't, though. Some, like Spartacus, would foment revolution and fight back. Does that speak to you?
It does. And I think it probably goes to a question that we may or may not know an answer to. I mean, it's trying to understand, why does a lion become a lion, or a tiger become a tiger, and I don't mean that just solely in that sense, but just other situations where you might be in a crowd having the same exact profession, having the same exact label that identifies who you are, and yet you choose to strive beyond that. You choose to break through whatever the imaginary wall is of what you can and can't accomplish in life. I mean, think about how workplaces are set up in many of the situations. You come in, you have a particular profession. How often, maybe rarely, maybe not even never, not situations that I've heard of, that you go into a job interview and you're asked the question of, would you like to become the CEO of this organization? Or, here are the steps for you to achieve in order to become the CEO. So I think, to a degree, where does that drive come from, and why do some have it and maybe others don't, or everyone has it? It just truly is different as far as unique to who that person is. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that, because I think it's so dependent on the individual. I mean, it's the same exact way. Think about it, not only in our case, but anyone else that's listening right now. We all have 24 hours, right? Out of those 24 hours, let's say we have, 16 working hours, 14, whatever the number is. Why is
Seven
it
and a
that-
half.
7.5? Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Circumstances are different. But in those situations, why is it that some choose to get up at 5 or 6 a.m. in the morning, and then they go and take on the day? So whether that means doing their form of miracle morning, writing a book, riding a bike, whatever it is, and the others don't choose to do those things? Why is it that in situations where there appears to be very little motivation, some people are able to find and others not? Even when there is nothing to be motivated by. So I don't know how much of that is just a conditioned way of thinking, or something that one learns as far as the drive comes. Maybe I was just very fortunate to have had a group of people in my life, such as my adoptive parents, who worked their butts off and helped me understand what work ethic looks like. And then I also happen to have a best friend who works literally his entire life. So for me, in a way, maybe I did become the byproduct of my environment.
I'll keep it real, because I love keeping it real. I often wish more than you might imagine. And as many conversations as you and I have had, Oleg, I don't think I've ever revealed this to you.
Yeah.
I often wish I did not have a high drive.
Mm-hmm.
I have a very, very profound, intense drive to achieve my goals. But I wish I didn't have it. If I were to be totally honest, it's a curse. Do you ever wish you did not have your drive?
I wish that I wish that I didn't have certain elements of it. And what I mean by that is, I've experienced moments in my life, and I think I had a kind of conversation like this with Josh Corporal, where we're talking about the dangers of being too driven in life. One of the dangers that I've experienced in being too driven, and I'd love to hear your perspective as far as what you've been through, as well as anyone that's listening. One of the dangers I've experienced in being too driven is that in being so driven and so goal-oriented, I put some of the other things on the back burner. One of those things being relationships. Keeping in touch with friends and family on a more frequent basis. So the whole time what I was doing is I was building towards these aspirations, towards these goals, and I was accomplishing and achieving them. But what I realized after a while, in my opinion, what gave me even greater satisfaction is being able to connect with my friends and family, being able to converse with them and share my life with them. Because at the end of the day, I think as amazing as some of these accomplishments and goals I might have throughout my life, the thing that's one of the things that are most important to me are relationship. It's human connection. And so when I made the switch, I noticed that my drive might have had an impact on it. But at the same time, I found more fulfillment because I was able to be in the moment and really spend the time and the energy to connect with people. And I think for those that really know me for who I am, they can relate and know that I am someone who does take the time to intentionally connect with individuals and learn from them, learn about myself. So I think there's something to be said about that. What would you say the dangers have been for you in being too driven in your life?
Frustration. Frustration if my goals aren't being met. Frustration if I feel as though the things that I'm willing to bring to the table in order to live out my drive are not being appreciated. Or if I feel like I'm being punished for having drive, or if having drive is viewed as something that's a negative, which it is in many professional situations. Fortunately, the most important relationships in my life have been with people that understand and accept my drive. I always joke, the monster I am is the monster that they know. So they're not usually surprised by the intensity of the drive because it's apparent pretty much the second that they meet me. And in fact, if I were to not actualize the drive in one way or another, and this is why sometimes I feel like it's a curse, because I have this reaction. I can feel extreme. The intensity of the drive can flip over into the intensity of frustration and anger if I am not able to go anywhere with it. Richard Marks, I want to say
very
hello.
Profound remark.
Yep. Richard, before I say anything else, I want to take a second to acknowledge every time you join in these calls, you manage to elevate the conversation. And I really want to express gratitude for that. It's very special. I wonder sometimes, whereas I tend to be extreme, either I am pushing forward, or doggone mad that I'm not able to push forward. I might get the blahs for like a day, but it doesn't really sit with me. If I had that, I do wonder, almost by implication, if that's what Richard's saying, that could either be a cause or an effect. If it were a cause, it's just that I was too busy languishing.
That's a good question.
Right, to have the motivation to do anything, or else I'm feeling like I'm powerless to do anything and therefore languishing, which to me goes then to another question. Power and drive.
Yeah.
I will assume, but correct me if I'm wrong, because we don't like to use the word we, or certainly to tell the internal stories of others. So correct me if I'm incorrect, but you on some level must have felt as though you had the power to change your circumstance in Russia.
Yeah.
Or you wouldn't have attempted to.
Yeah. I feel like I had the ability or a feeling that I might be able to change it. Now, I will also say this. I'm reflecting upon all this as a 28-year-old and 9 years old. I think for me, I didn't really weigh out all of the possible options and how it's all going to play out if I choose to go one way and not the other. So to bring back the reality of the situation, I think as a 9-year-old kid, having had the ability to make such decision, what I realized was that for me, it truly was about just making the decision and living with the consequences that that decision was going to bring with it. Now I think I make decisions slightly in a slightly different way. And that is, I do weigh out the options. I do consider the effort and the energy and everything else that it's going to take in order to be able to have the change that I'm able to have. So power, I think, is a part of that component of being driven. Power, what I mean by power is the ability, the willpower to be able to do that. And I think outside of that, it's also something that maybe sometimes I take for granted, maybe not. I'll share with you a quick story, and Richard Marks and Kenneth and everyone else that's joined us right now. So this morning, one of the things that I started doing within my life, I've had this routine for however many days or years by now where I do certain things like meditating, journaling, and stuff like that. Well, within the last couple of days, a really close friend of mine, she had recommended something that she started doing by Hal Elrod called the Miracle Morning. Essentially, it's the same exact thing. The only difference now is that you have a physical chart where you can write down the 5 or 10, however many things that you want to experience changes in your life. And then you're given a chart of days. So day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way through 30. And so each day you get to mark it, check off the box, whether or not you completed that activity. Well, this morning, as I was doing that routine, actually right before I was about to go into meditation, I was going to my fridge to make a quick breakfast. And I noticed that I had a carton of eggs that was about to expire within the next 2 days. And I mentioned this in the story, like, I'm proud of being able to finish multiple eggs, but like 17 in 2 days was just way too many. I'd literally have to eat eggs for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 2 days to really utilize it.
We'll teach you about eating eggs.
Yeah. So I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know what action to take. I went into the meditation, and it was during that time that I had realized a message that Steve Gamblin actually talks about. And it's the acts of kindness that he chooses to do throughout his life. So whether it's buying groceries for someone else, helping in someone in X, Y, and Z way. And it was right after I was done meditating, I had realized this ability, this drive to go out in the kitchen, boil all those eggs, and literally drive a block or however many blocks down the road and give it to the next homeless person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I did that. Now, I think much of that had to do with my drive. I think much of that had to do with my ability. And I think if anything, it had to do with my ability to recognize an opportunity or recognize really a privilege that I had. And that's a carton of eggs that was going to expire in 2 days that I was probably going to throw away, if I'm being honest. But then Steve's message subconsciously reminded me that there's another way. There's another way to do this. And the whole reason why I bring up this story is because of this. I believe that when it comes to drive, when it comes to having the ability, when it comes to being able to accomplish the goals, the dreams, their aspirations in life, your environment plays a very big role in that. The people that you choose, in my opinion, to let into your life are the most likely the people that you are going to mimic and model the behaviors of. So in this case, hearing Steve and letting him into my life, it impacted my actions moving forward. So in developing the drive, in developing all of this, I think much of that also has to do with the environment as well as the individual will to do it.
Mm-hmm. Kenneth asked us to call him Kenny. So Kenny, I am calling you Kenny from now on. Thank you for opening that door. Richard says that there is a positive side to drive because of the amazing things that people can do because of that drive within a single lifetime. And sometimes those lifetimes are very short. An extreme example is Ryan White, a boy in the 80s who got AIDS and was treated like garbage. He was very young when this happened, and he may have been banned from his school and people wouldn't touch him and all that sort of stuff. He died at a very young age as well, but the activism that stories about his journey as a juvenile AIDS patient changed the world. And that's a case where I really feel that drive, whether it was him or his parents, I don't remember how it all played out, really did lead to unimaginable consequences, unimaginably positive consequences because of it.
Yeah. Benjamin
Oh,
Franklin.
yes. Yes, absolutely.
Do you know much about his story?
I don't know as much about his story as I'm sure Richard and you do. So.
I don't know much about him, but it always inspires me to be able to go back into history of people who were a part of our lives and be able to understand what drove them, what inspired them, what was their motivation behind certain decisions, certain things that they were doing. This right here, looking at the routine, I mean, I guess it looks relatively complex when it's written out, but the reality of the matter is when you look at your own routine, if you were to write it out on a sheet of paper, it would probably be very similar.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of value. I think there's a lot of value that our routine has in being driven. I think a routine is a good, not necessarily a routine organization.
Yeah.
I think is a critical component to being driven.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
I would say that if you want to focus your drive, organization certainly is critical. And most people that I've encountered who are driven find a way to be organized, even if it's not first nature for them. Maybe they get someone in their lives that helps organize them. If not, they figure out pretty quickly how to organize themselves, or else the energy that they have just sort of ends up out in the world, not really going anywhere. What good shall I do today is the question Ben Franklin asked. And that is something, I ask it a little bit differently. I ask, how are my actions today, or how are my plans fulfilling my providential purpose? But I do that predicated on an assumption that the providential purpose is something good. I will admit that assumption.
Yeah.
Go ahead, say what you want to, because I wanted to pivot a little bit.
I was going to say, I ask myself, what can I do to make someone else's day better?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then just do that thing.
And Kenny says he is so darn organized. I do not doubt that, Kenny. Thank you very much. Something tells me, without really knowing you, except the flavor that you enable us to savor, something tells me just about the way that you present, there is organization there.
Yeah.
I just don't perceive you somehow as scattered. And Kenny also asks, isn't everybody organized? No. I love you, Kenny, but
that's just the truth.
Yeah. No. Here is something I've wrestled with. I did wrestle with for many years. I don't really wrestle with it anymore. Mm-hmm. Drive being a curse. I once worked with a man. Mm-hmm. He and I had a job together. Actually, I was kind of, not quite, but kind of his supervisor on some projects. He was not driven at all. He's, as an attorney, said, I believe in 9 to 5. I don't ever want to rise that high. He took his lunch hour every day. He left the second that clock hit 5. Never worked late. Was very chill. Always found a lot of time to hang out and talk on the phone, or be on the wife, or listen to music. It really was mostly interested in his free time with playing guitar and having drinks and hanging out with his friends, doing video games. All that's totally cool. And he and there was a job opening. It was a pretty high level job. And I met the qualifications and I applied for it. And he did not meet the qualifications and applied for it. We both went for an interview. I don't believe that the interviews we went to, I went for the job that I applied for. He went for a job that he had applied for that he was more akin to his qualifications. I had more attorney experience. I had more experience in the direct subject matter area. I had more litigation experience. It was a managerial position. I had more managerial experience. I had more experience and a greater breadth of experience in every aspect of the job.
Right.
I had a stronger network, and I had drive. And due to that drive, I was known to work a lot of hours and put in whatever it took to get that done. He got it. He himself said, I'm not qualified for this. I didn't apply for it. I am less qualified than you are for it, Scott. That's true. He had an explanation for it that had to do with demographics. We'll just put it that way. And I was frustrated by that. And I was all the more frustrated when he ended up leaving that job under a cloud. Later, someone who wanted to hire another individual that was for a job that required a lot of drive. It required a certain experience, background, and disposition. In fact, that experience was so specific that the job post was explicitly written for me. Mm-hmm. Because this person knew that I had the drive to do whatever it took to get this job done. I interviewed for it and was told you're the appropriate candidate for it. He didn't interview for it, was called up, got the job, even though he did not have the relevant experience. Again, my drive was frustrating.
I don't know what the lesson learned there is.
and he basically said, I'm not qualified for this. I didn't ask for this job. Of course, I'll take it. But I didn't ask for it. I have no particular drive as ever. No desire to succeed in it. But if they want me and give me more money, knowing full well I have no interest in putting in any extra hours, any work, and I'm less qualified than the person the job was written for, of course I will happily do it. And then there ended up being a big kerfluffle at the last minute, and he ended up not even taking the job, allegedly because he didn't want to work on the same floor as someone who he had worked with before who he didn't personally like. And of course, by then I was under no circumstances ever going to take that job, or even asked to be considered for a job in that world again. And so the reason why I say, to me, having drive is a curse is because looking back at that, I wonder if the very drive that I had, the desire to succeed and the willingness to put in those hours, set me up for failure. It almost created a sense of entitlement that I would get certain rewards for it, or that I would achieve certain things, or that certain outcomes would occur. Whereas if I had simply sat back and said, I don't care. I'll just put in whatever work I need to. And if I succeed or not, doesn't matter. Yeah. Maybe I wouldn't have faced that sort of disappointment, because I would have walked in, my life would have been nothing but wonderful surprises, because even though I didn't care, roses would still be thrown in my direction.
Yeah.
So was my having drive actually a bad thing? Kenny, I saw your comment that you said 3 times. I said the same thing 3 times and many more. Like I said, I've since worked through it, and I'm not, it was all part of Providence. That's just the way it was. But yes, I asked that question. I asked it in perhaps more graphic terms than you would, but you're a civilized human being, and my reaction to that was not a civilized. Oleg, was my drive bad? And before we move on, Susan Cruz. I want to just digress for a minute. I don't know Susan Cruz if you listened to, I believe it was last week's show. But at some point recently on one of the shows that Oleg and I do together, he asked whether there was someone that believed in me when no one else did. And Susan Cruz, I gave your name. And that belief in me throughout my entire professional life has been one of the most profoundly sustaining things that I have ever had. So I just want to take a second to acknowledge that, and since you're here, make sure that you knew it. Oleg, was my drive a bad thing?
I don't know if it was necessarily bad or good, or I think I've experienced similar moments like that. I've been very fortunate to not be in many positions where I had to rely on circumstances such as this one. However, there's a story that I'll tell that can relate to what you just described. And it's not necessarily one person getting the job over myself, but it's more so me being told one specific thing. I remember it was my sophomore year in college. I was applying for an internship at a translation firm to do some Russian translation to gain more experience in that particular field. I walked into the office. This was the first translation agency that I had contacted and applied for in a way. I walked into that office, and one of the very first things that I was told based on my resume was that I was way too overqualified. Now, how can that be possible when I have zero experience in the translation field? I didn't understand that. I might have been way too overqualified if it was the position to, I don't know, be a CEO, because I had all these different startups listed, literally like 5 or 10, and all the skills that I learned and all the money that I raised and everything. But I think it goes back to the same exact point that you had addressed, is being driven. I think that maybe is one of the dangers, or one of the things that can be perceived as a curse, is that because not everyone else is as driven as you are, seeing things like that, a lot of it also depends on how the information was presented. So if I hand you a resume that's literally 1 page compared to handing you a resume that's 5 pages, there's a difference. There are some assumptions that I could make that, okay, 5-page, more experience, and obviously very ambitious or whatever else. That's not always the case. Some people are able to fit the 5-page onto 1 page. But in many of the situations I've experienced, when it came down to the simple resume, I oftentimes received that saying, "You're overqualified for this position," even though I had zero experience in the field. That's why I was applying for the internship, to learn. So I think the drive, it's probably relatively the same thing. And it just reminds me that I don't think I'm here to please everyone, nor to be understood by everyone. And in those situations where the person doesn't understand that just because you have more things on your resume or list, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have gained all of that experience and all of that wisdom and the knowledge from each one. So I think if anything, in that case, what it does say is that, as exactly as Kenneth said, quality and not quantity. So it's hard. It's hard to be in those situations. It was hard for me to be in that situation, where the person said I was overly qualified. It was hard to really accept that as a possibility. It took some time. It took some time to get over it. And see, the challenge of that particular statement, at least for me, and I'd be curious to hear how it was for you, Scott, or Richard, or Kenny, or Susan, or anyone else that's listening, is that once I heard the fact that I was overqualified, I lowered my standard for the next one.
And then did you get the job?
Then I got the internship. I didn't have the same expectations. But the problem of that is, at least the way that I experience, is that in lowering the standard for the job prior to getting the job, it actually lowered the standard while I had the job.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't feel like, okay, I didn't have to perform as high as I had to because the X, Y, and Z wasn't taken as seriously as I thought it would. So this perception of, do you have the drive and the willingness and the ambition to go X, Y, and Z? It wasn't a pillar. It wasn't a pillar that the company operated from. And so it can impact you. It can influence the way that you show up to work. I mean, it's the same exact thing. Think about it this way. You show up to a job, and if there is no sense of structure or organization, not necessarily you got to be in your seat at 9 a.m. in the morning and you got to be leaving at 5, but more so structure and organization as far as, hey, This is when we're going to start the call. This is when we're going to do the meeting. This is an agenda for it. If those things don't exist, then everything is up in the air. Show up whenever you want, do whatever you want. So how are we ever going to get to the point where we can accomplish some of the common goals that we do have?
That is a drive-related question, because in other jobs that I've had,
Yeah.
I have been able to be successful by motivating staff to raise their own standards and to achieve things to beyond what might have been expected, particularly when I was in government, where the expectations about what was achievable were not always the most ambitious. Richard jokes and said maybe he should lower his standards. It could be fun. And then Kenny jokingly says he'll never lower his. And Susan responds, maybe they should be raised. One of the things that Richard's remark in particular, though, goes as to was a conversation that I had about some staff relation issues that I had in one of my jobs. And the position that I took with some of my staff members was that we have a lot that we can accomplish. We have a lot of great minds in the room.
Right.
And we are in a milieu that has accepted mediocrity for too long. We can each rise, and it's in all of our interests, but most importantly, in the interests of the public, if we each raise our standards and say, just getting it done or getting it done in a way that's okay isn't good enough, but in a way that pushes the boundaries and puts us in a position where, as a group, we have a legacy in this administration that builds our credibility with the public and lasts far beyond us. And so when it came to the individual one-on-ones I would have with my staff, I would be very, very aggressive. In the staff meetings I had, I would always push hard for people to perform. And my boss pulled me aside at one point and she said, Scott, it's great that you have high expectations, but these people aren't making as much money as you are. You're expecting too much from them. You can't expect people to want to do great things when they're not making what you're making, or when they are in a different title than you are. So really you need to pull back a little bit. And interestingly enough, after that, during interviews I would have with various jobs I had, you always get asked, what are your weaknesses? And I would answer as my weakness. And this was not one of these, let me cover up a strength and pretend it's a weakness and then everyone is impressed with that. It really wasn't. I meant it because I felt I'd learned a lesson that way. The answer that I would give is I have to check myself because I can push people too hard. My drive to succeed, my ambition level is so great, and my drive is so hard, and I get so caught up in my own mode of thinking that I can forget that not everyone has that.
Yeah.
And so I push people and they end up feeling alienated or not considered or being asked to be something that they're not, and it can be counterproductive.
Yeah.
Now, really what I was saying was that I needed to apply more emotional intelligence in how I got people to raise standards, but also was realistic about where standards could go.
Yeah.
But I would frame it in a way so that the employer that I would be interviewing with would be clear that I wouldn't try and raise standards so great that their staff would quit or be demoralized. What do you think about how do you respond when you hear that story?
So I am the type of individual who not only pushes himself and has a very, I guess you could say, a high standard of living when it comes to many things, but also it's a responsibility I carry to be able to create a space for other people to create similar standard for their lives. Now, it could be different, but I think personally, I find it challenging to be in situations where if we're trying to achieve a certain thing, a certain outcome, and I'm putting certain energy towards it, and you're putting certain energy towards it, and whoever else is putting certain energy towards it, And then there's one person that doesn't choose to put energy towards it. And whether it's due to a form of not communicating, just misalignment, whatever it is, that's something I struggle with. I find that challenging because if we're all trying to achieve that same goal, not only is communication key, but also if I'm going to be surrounded by people who aren't as driven, and what I mean by that is not necessarily have the same exact drive or even be working the same number of hours. But for example, if you say that you're going to commit your word to accomplishing X, Y, and Z, however you do it, when you do it, that's your journey. But the fact that you do it, it's important because it still maintains that level of energy that here's a person who is just as committed as the rest of us. So do I sometimes push people too hard when it comes to that? Probably. I probably do. But how do you not do that? I think one of the things that I have done relatively well over the past however many years is I've really respected people's goals and ambitions for what they are. So whatever your goals are, whatever your aspirations are, those are your things. For me, the important thing is, are you willing to take the time to accomplish those, however long it takes? Are you willing to put some work towards it? I struggle when people say certain things and they don't do those things. So it's not necessarily all goal oriented, but for example, let's say you're wanting to change one of your personal habits of, I don't know, drinking a glass of water in the morning. And you don't do that. And then you come back to me and you repeat the same exact quote unquote problem or issue that happens in your life due to not drinking water. I find it challenging because it's like, well, how can I support? How can I support? I can help support. I can support emotionally. I can support in helping whatever way, helping create the discipline, the routine, whatever. But if there's no action that's being put towards it, then it's challenging. It's challenging for me to be in a space like that. And that's where I think the drive, my own personal drive, becomes a little bit dangerous because then I'm noticing myself, okay, now I'm developing resentment and all these other things towards the individual for not doing the things that they committed to. It was their word.
It goes as to what Richard Mark said earlier about being compassionate.
Yeah.
Because that is where a real hard drive without a sense of self-awareness or a sense of boundaries that people may have around what their own goals and objectives are can lead to not being able to assess those differences or accept those differences and then end up either frustrated or angry or looking down on them.
But what's the fine line then? What's the fine line between maintaining that compassion and understanding that after a while you're still showing, and I guess maybe there isn't because everyone's on their own clock, so to speak. But for example, Scott, if you were to come back to me and say, man, this thing has been happening for however many years in my life now, I want to change it, and you literally don't put any effort towards it. And what I mean by that is that you will, like, what if you acknowledge that I haven't done anything towards it? Like, where does that line then between still showing compassion and understanding that maybe this is not the best fit for me because it is having such a great impact on my own drive, confidence, courage, and whatever else.
Richard says, and this actually is directly relevant to my answer. Richard says drive plus compassion equals love. So I have not been secretive about the fact that I have a history of diabetes. Many years ago, more than 15 years ago, I believe. Yeah. In fact, it may even be closer to 20 years ago at this point. I'm not 100% sure. I don't remember when. It's been that long. Yeah. I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And basically what happened with the first doctor I had is that he just gave me a bunch of medicine and said, take it. And I didn't he didn't suggest that I do some of the things that people are commonly urged to do when they have that condition, like check your blood glucose, be mindful of the highs and the lows, make certain dietary changes, all these sorts of things. And then later I went to another doctor.
Right.
And I told him what medicines I was taking. He said, there's a bunch of duplication with these medicines. I don't know why you're taking like 2 or 3 of the same things. And have you made these dietary changes? And why not? And da da da. And I said, my doctor never told me to do any of this. And I'll never forget what happened next. He put his hand in a fist, and you could just see him barely containing his irritation. And he pounded it on the desk, and he said, Scott, you have to take responsibility for your own health. Basically, he said, in the United States, people get advice about how to put diabetes in, right? But diabetes was the example that applied to me. Put diabetes in remission all the time, but no one does it. They hear the same advice over and over, and they just don't do it. So he didn't explicitly say this, but his message was pretty clear. There's no reason why any of us should believe that you're any different than anyone else. We give the same advice, and we'll give you the same advice, and I know you'll do nothing. So come back to me in 3 months and prove anything's changed.
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't anyone else. That same drive that pushes me and everyone around me and can be such a curse got my, to take control of my health. And part of why I don't remember when exactly this diagnosis has been was that it's so long ago and the change has been so permanent. I haven't been on any medicine for as long as I can remember.
Yeah.
And in fact, my doctor sometimes now tells me your blood glucose is better than mine. And so when I think about that, I can't help but reflect. My drive got me to a good place in my life.
Right.
Well, really, the numbers that I have now are typical of people that will live an unusually long, healthy life, as opposed to what they might have been before. And I know that it can be done.
Yeah.
So when I hear about people, or when I know people who can make the exact same changes that I did, but do nothing, I do have a challenge with compassion.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of times I can sit back and say, well, circumstances are what they are, and there may be a lot in their story that I don't understand. But then this goes us to another element about the formula that Richard put out, which is, to me, transformative. And I want to think about, as usual, Richard, you elevated the conversation with a comment. But where does compassion move into enabling?
Yes.
And then where does lack of compassion, or how do you, if you find a balance between compassion and expecting high performance from people, where does that move into narcissism? Well, I can do it. You're less than me because you can't.
Yeah. Really good questions. I think for me, the first one, where and when does compassion move into enabling something that I've experienced, and I won't give any names, but it's someone who is relatively close to me, someone within my immediate circle. And I realized that within the past however many years, I chose to support her in different ways due to her financial situation that she was in. And after a while, I realized what I was doing was, even though I was showing a level of compassion that, yes, she's experiencing X, Y, and Z challenges, and she's not able to work the same exact way or the same exact schedule, same exact routine. But after a while, it did become a form of enabling, because there was last conversation I had with her. She forgot to hit end on the phone call, and she said words that, I can't believe that he didn't give me any money. And so it was in that moment I realized that there is a fine line. I don't know what it is. I don't know when to draw it. I don't know how it happens. But if anything, what I've also learned is, I don't know if anyone can relate to this or not, or if you can relate to this, Scott, but I've had many people throughout my life who believe in this concept of helping hand and not a handout. And I think what that meant to me when I first heard about it is that there were people who were willing to help me to get to whatever it is that I'm trying to get to. But to give you those things without having to put in the work that they might have had to put in order to be able to achieve some of the or build some of these things, such as a network or resources, was important to them. And I think that somehow is tied to this whole concept of how do you know if you're enabling someone? And how do you know if you're simply being compassionate to them due to whatever, their circumstances, the things that they might have gone through, their experiences? I know Susan had mentioned here an interesting comment that I think is worthwhile exploring. To me, everyone and their background and ongoing experiences are different. Some people need more time. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Because there were times when I needed more time to develop certain things, when I needed more time to develop the courage, the confidence, and to do the different things that I'm able to do now. But at the same time, how do you know that? And how do you empower someone in knowing that, yes, certain things require a certain amount of time, but at the same time, like if I don't push you, Scott, towards writing your book or getting your speaking even more off the ground than what it is, then you might just fall and settle into that comfort.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Kenny.
Richard Mark, same exact point.
Yeah.
COVID-19. What kind of drive is appropriate now? And
where?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that last, would you mind putting that up one more time, Oleg? The last question is something that, at least to my eyes, goes back to the very beginning of this conversation. And that is when I was asking you, where did that drive to leave Russia come from? And why did you not merely submit? Richard asks, where should our drive be directed? I'll throw out my answer to that.
Yeah.
I don't pretend that it's definitive. It's just my thinking on it.
Yeah.
But it has implications as to what we're talking about, I suspect. I believe that our drive should be directed in the place that Providence is directing us. I personally have come to not believe that drive is necessarily, it may be innate, it may be something that some of us have to varying degrees, or the dispositional characteristics that when the right environmental circumstances occur are triggered, and then the drive comes out or not. But where it goes, what it looks like, and what it means, I believe, and whether we have those dispositions, is something that is from a place beyond us. And the reason why I say that is because I actually experience my drive as coming from outside of me and then through me. And as I've lived my life and experienced more and more of it, that feeling, Oleg, has gotten stronger. Not only that, but the outcomes of the drive, even when they've been led to frustration and anger on my end, have led to places that are unexpected. So I told you all the story of the jobs that I applied for on two separate occasions, only to be turned down by someone that was less qualified. And in fact, in one case, in both cases, hadn't even applied for those jobs instead of me. And I mentioned before I started that story that I had resolved those issues. I had feelings of anger about it for a long time, but I'm past it. Part of that is because ultimately, in those situations, that person's drive or lack thereof led him to a certain place in his life where I assume he's happy, but he has not, at least externally, achieved what I have achieved.
Yeah.
He received what I believe was beyond a helping hand. I believe he was given, I think he was just given an elevator and said, here's the button, press. But because he didn't have to walk up the stairs, he never learned how to push. And that, if there even was a trigger in him, it never got activated at the same level.
Yeah.
That frustration, the drive that I had, has transmogrified in my life in the face of those rejections into an even stronger and stronger push, which I would never have felt coming from without. And they're lessons, by the way, that I might not have ever had those two particular situations occurred. I don't know if how I experience my drive is something that is actually real or if my mind is making it up. I will say that there are many days when I do my hour-long power walk and meditate and think that I wish I had not the drive that I do. I didn't ask for it, is how I feel. But I've got it, so I go with it.
Yeah. Well, I'll also say, kind of agree to disagree in some of the things that you said. I think
no, never. I have to be right.
Right. I think the component of you didn't ask for it, there might be a lot of truth. Well, it's not, let me rephrase that. There is a lot of truth according to your lens to how you see it. I will say that there are certain situations where I looked at some of the things like, I didn't ask for this skill, or I didn't ask for this ability to be able to communicate with people that I'm able to, but it's something that I'm given. It's something that I was able to develop in order to help myself elevate as a human and help other people who are within my journey to do the same thing. So I think as challenging as it could be to manage a particular skill or a tool, such as the ability to be driven, the ability to be well-spoken, the ability to be Scott Mason at 7 a.m. in the morning. Like, that's an ability that not many people have. You got to think about, like, that's just the reality of the matter. So there's a lot of positive within that. And I'm not saying that to, change your mind or help you reframe or anything. I'm just acknowledging the fact that I think there's certain gifts and abilities that I'm able to develop. And there's certain gifts and abilities that I maybe rediscover throughout my life. And yes, it becomes a challenge for me. And I've experienced the same exact thing. Like, I didn't ask for this. Why am I having to deal with X, Y, and Z? But the reality of the matter is they're all serving me somehow. They're all serving me in some way to help me get to that, whatever that end thing is. I have no idea. But I think being driven like I am, I think it's a blessing and a curse. I think it's a double-edged sword. I think being as accepting as I am, being as non-judgmental as I am in many of the situations, it's a blessing and a curse, because I'm able to see both sides. I'm able to see the situations where I can deeply connect with the individual. And then I'm also able to see the situations where I want to do nothing else but to run away from people in general, from all people, because I think, like, too many conversations, sometimes it's a little bit an overload of information. So it's harder for me to really take a step back and, like, reflect and process. Like, what did I learn from this conversation, considering that I had 11 of them, So I think too much of anything, whatever the phrase is, I'm sure you might be able to fill in the blank here, but, like, too much of anything could be bad or harm, or I completely butchered the phrase, but I think you get the meaning.
Well,
right?
Kenny, Kenny says Scott Mason at 7 in the morning. So just to give folks some context, I used to have
please.
7 a.m. mornings 7 a.m. meetings every Thursday. And I was to give a little presentation at every one of those meetings. And so I would walk in there full bombast. Y'all think I'm loud here? Wait till you see my 6'1", 215-pound self standing in a room of people going ballistic and having lots of space to really move my hands around and yell and scream at 7 in the morning. And why do I mention that? Because, Kenny, I bet as much as you might like to savor the flavor of some Scott Mason at 7 a.m., I think many people thought it was too much of a good thing. Of exactly, we're wondering if seeing Scott Mason go crazy at 7 in the morning was a blessing,
or a curse. Yeah. But that goes back to who you are. That goes back to who you are as an individual. You have realized that about yourself. And I mean, yes, you have a choice. You can change it. You can, quote unquote, tone it down or lower your standard or lower your drive, or you can just continue pursuing what you're doing. And I think, if anything, what I'm taking away from this conversation is the importance of recognizing that there is a choice. There is a choice between the standard that you choose to set for your life. There is a choice between how driven you choose to be, regardless of the circumstances. If someone else gets that job, or if you receive what I've received, and that is you're overly qualified or too qualified for the position, well, maybe it wasn't necessarily that was the position that wasn't right for you. Maybe it was the environment or the culture or the actual organization's mission that wasn't right for you. And so being able to articulate and read between the lines, for me, it's more important than being able to read what's on the lines.
I will say that's one thing that I have learned to accept. When I feel like I haven't gotten a job or an opportunity, and instead it's gone to someone that I view as less qualified or less, quote unquote, deserving, or less appropriate. Really, it is me. That's a narrative. That's a story I'm imposing on what happened. That may have nothing to do with reality. It may have been that I screwed up the interview. It may have been that I had bad breath that day and they didn't want to work with someone who had coffee breath. And heaven knows I love my coffee. So that's a distinct possibility. And recognizing those stories. But what I'm curious about when it comes to recognizing those stories is when you say we have a choice. I like to, as a matter of philosophical preference, say we have a choice. I had a choice when I didn't get those jobs to be angry, or to be resigned, or to be joyful. I had a choice as to whether I would become more ambitious or not, or to give up. Except what I don't know sometimes, and this goes against my own philosophical tenets. I don't even know that I believe it, so I'm just going to throw it out there. Is that when it comes to giving up, sometimes I don't know if I really have a choice. Maybe on some theoretical level, I could sit back and say, Scott, you have a choice. You can just give up. I never consciously do that. My default is to move into rising up and fighting even harder, or doubling down, or escalating, turning my attention elsewhere and saying, okay, how can I make the absolute most of this situation that I'm in? Maybe it's because I've made choices earlier in my life so frequently that they're habituated now. That's possible, I would admit.
Well, I think you do have the choice, though. I think how I understand choice, and it might be important to clarify what choice means to you. To me, choice means an option. So in that case, you have the option to give up. Your willpower tells you not to because of previous whatever life circumstances, or just doesn't align with who you are. I'm the same exact way. If anything, what I've realized is that option is always there. Always there. I mean, it really is. Henry Ford said it. At least I think it's Henry Ford. I keep attributing it to him, and I've never met the guy, but hopefully it's him.
I heard he's not speaking to you, by the way.
Anyways, there's this one thing that he said, and that is whether you think you can or whether you think you can't. You're right. And I think what that points to is that there is an option that you get to choose the option. Whether you think you can write the book or you can't write the book, whether you think you can speak or you can't speak, whether you think you can have a difficult conversation or you can't have a difficult conversation. The option is yours. And having the willpower to choose that option, I think that's the difference. But I think within that, there's also many other components, probably for a different conversation, like awareness. Are you aware of your options? Are you aware of the different choices available to you?
Are you willing to accept that those choices exist?
Are you willing to accept that those choices exist? Are you willing to act upon those choices? Are you willing to live with the consequences of those choices? Whether it's the consequences you experience internally or the consequences that you experience by the third party.
Richard Marx looks like he researched the exact quote, put it up there for us.
Yeah. Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. I think there's something missing within that. Not from Richard Marx, but I think how he initially said it, Henry Ford. In my opinion, I think it's whether you think you can or whether you think you can't. You're right. ... The choice is yours. You know, I think that part sometimes gets like left out. That for me sometimes creates a little bit more tension. Yes, it requires me to think, but at the same time, some of these things, I don't know if I'm making sense here. I feel like some of these things should just be verbalized to the 10th degree instead of leaving that final. To me, that's a critical step. You know, in that case, you give person the option, but you don't specify that you get to choose.
Speaking of choices,
Yeah.
I'm going to turn the conversation a little bit.
Okay.
Everyone who has participated in this conversation has one choice. And I'm going to ask you to make that choice. And I'm going to use every bit of my drive to hope, push, and humbly request that you make the one that I agree with.
Yeah.
And that is to write a review like the beautiful one that Richard Marx did.
Yeah.
Of this show on our Facebook or LinkedIn page if you enjoyed it.
Yeah, Richard Marx said some incredible words about it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes this space so beautiful, is that we're able to come together, and even in moments where we agree to disagree, we're still able to find the meaning within the things that we're having a conversation with. And there's just something beautiful about a space like that, because I can't say that it exists everywhere. I know, Scott, you create spaces like this through your podcast, the speaking, different things that you do, but there truly is something powerful about being able to create a space where not only the individual is heard, but more so can develop a different perspective when it comes to their purpose, their meaning, their story, and their circumstances in life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk about the spaces that we have created. Oleg, I was gossiping about you earlier, and you confirmed that some of the gossip that I'd heard about you is true. So tell me, is it true also that you have a couple of podcasts? Is that or is that just wild rumor mongering?
Wild accusations. No, I do. One of the shows that you're able to see here, it's called Overcoming Odds. What it is and the way that I can describe it to people today with the knowledge that I have, it's a space for people to be able to better understand their own strengths and their uniqueness to the world. It's a space for people to share stories about overcoming difficult circumstances and hardships within their lives. As part of that, what I've also started simultaneously is another show called The Power of Your Story. And what it is probably exactly as it is described, is focusing on the narrative. It's understanding that, in my opinion, everything truly does boil down to the story. Everything that we said about that quote, whether you think you can or whether you think you can't, you're right. It's a story. What is the story that you choose to tell yourself around a set of circumstances of whether you think you can do a certain thing or whether you think you can't do a certain thing? And how convincing is that story in order to help you move you into action and purpose and meaning and whatever else? And I know that you have a show like that as well. Purpose Highway.
Yep. My podcast is Purpose Highway, and you have the link at the bottom of the screen here.
Mhm.
Purpose Highway exists in order to create spaces for influencers, leaders, entrepreneurs, and others to tell stories about how they connected to their higher purpose to build a better self and a better world.
Mhm.
I suggest that anyone who enjoyed tonight's conversation, in particular, listen to the most recent episode with former Project Runway winner Gretchen Jones. She's someone who
She was
is
awesome.
Thank you. She
Yeah.
really is she's someone who's able to engage and interested in engaging in these sorts of conversations that are truly elevating and transformational and that are actionable when it comes out to each of us using the gifts, skills, and experiences that we have to build a better world. I will also say one other thing that I'm proud of. Oleg, I don't know if you knew this yet, but I'm telling you now, and I'm telling you in particular because Richard Marks is in the house.
Mhm.
I am also the host of a new podcast that is being sponsored by Toastmasters District 46.
I didn't know that. That's awesome.
Is the Toastmasters district that oversees the New York City area. It is called Transformational Pathways, and it's stories of people who have been involved in Toastmasters, who have had their lives transformed. And it's not just for Toastmasters. In fact, it's for people who are interested in hearing the sagas of folks who have engaged in building up their communication skills to transform themselves and to become leaders.
That's awesome. That's huge. That's a really good group. I remember when I was able to join.
Yes.
That one time.
Yes. So this district oversees about 120, 125, between 118 and 125 clubs. Wow. And it has thousands of members, and it is a great podcast, and we hope that folks enjoy it. Richard, I had to say it because I know that you are a member. Well, I won't say how you or why you would be interested in that, but I know that that might be something that might interest you. So anyway, Oleg, do you have anything that you want to say before we close out for the night?
I think for me, what I am choosing to reflect upon after this conversation, well, first of all, I want to express my gratitude to Richard Marks, not only for being able to join during this particular conversation, but just creating a space where I was able to talk to him about my upcoming trip and everything that I was trying to focus on, and just wanted to thank you for that and just let you know that all of those things are developing as we speak. Kenneth for joining and sharing his comments, Susan, and so many other people that I think are able to create this space, Jessica and so many others that come in, and Caleb Pearson, Billy Atwell, that bring in their insights, because at the end of the day, and I mentioned this to other people, it's that, yes, it's the two of us that are able to start this dialogue, but at the end, this dialogue would not be much without the contributions that other people choose to bring to this space. So I just want to thank everyone for really being a part of this and making all this possible.
Thank you all. I share that gratitude as well. Have a wonderful night.